So today we are going to identify factors of a polynomial given the zeros and vice versa by switching the sign. So we're going to refer to something that we did a couple weeks ago first. So just follow along here. Let's say I have something like x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. And to solve this, I factored. So these are my factors. And then my next step was setting each factor equal to 0. And what that gave me were the zeros. That gave me where this graph is going to hit the x-axis. And now how did I get the zeros? When I set each factor equal to 0, essentially all that happens is the sign switched. So if it was x plus 4, the 0 became negative 4. And if it was x minus 2, the 0 was positive. So to go back and forth between factors and zeros, you're essentially just switching the sign. Understand, though, that factors have x's attached to them. So if a factor is x plus 4, then the corresponding 0 is negative 4. You're switching the sign. But zeros are just numbers. Factors have an x. If my factor is x minus 2, my corresponding 0 is 2. So let's get a little bit of practice just with that right there. So if I have a factor of x minus 7, then my corresponding 0 would be 7. If I have a factor of x plus 9, so let's just write these are my factors, and these are my corresponding zeros. If my factor is x plus 9, my corresponding 0 would be negative 9. Now, notice again that the factors have x's and the zeros are just values where it hits the x-axis. Now, a little twist. X. We're changing the sign of what's being added or subtracted to the x. So what's being added or subtracted to the x? Well, 0 is. So if the factor is x, then the 0 is 0. So that's kind of a little twist. If your factor is x, your 0 is 0, and vice versa. Now, let's go in the other direction. And again, this isn't on your sheet anywhere. This is just talking about it. If my 0 is 2, to find my factor, I'm changing the sign, but make sure that your factor has an x minus 2. If my 0 is negative 10, then my factor has to have an x, and it becomes x plus 10. If my 0 is 0, well, that's my special one, then my factor is x. To go back and forth between factors and zeros, you're switching the sign. Factors have x's, zeros don't. Now, another thing that's very, very important about this lesson is that you need to, in your head, link zeros and factors. If I have the zeros, I have the factors. If I have the factors, I have the zeros. That's super, super, super important, because what you're going to find is that this lesson is going to seem very easy to you, because computationally, it's pretty easy. However, conceptually, you need to, in your mind, link factors with zeros. I have a factor, that means I have a zero. I have a 0, that means I have a factor. So let's take a look at the first example now. On your worksheet, it's in your Unit 2 packet. It should say something factors and zeros. It's giving me the factors. And once I have the factors, I can write the equation of a polynomial by just listing the factors. So if x plus 2 is a factor, then that means that my zeros, I'm going to put squiggly brackets for the zeros. My first 0 must be negative 2. Because if x plus 2 is a factor, then negative 2 is a 0. If x minus 4 is a factor, then 4 is a 0. If x plus 1 is a factor, then negative 1 is a 0. And that's it. You're just changing the sign, but understand that zeros are just numbers and factors have an x. To go back and forth between them, you're just changing the sign. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds. Try number 2 on your own. Number 2, my zeros. If x minus 6 is a factor, then 6 is a 0, -3, +8. You're just changing the sign of the factors. Understand that zeros don't have x's, factors do. Little twist on number 3. The -6 and the +3 should be pretty straightforward, so that x minus 6 gives me a 0 of 6, the x plus 3 gives me a 0 of -3, and the x gives me a 0 of 0. Again, if a factor is x, then the corresponding 0 is 0, because you're technically adding 0, and when you negate that, it's still 0. Now, constant terms do not affect the zeros. So in number 4, we have that -2 in front of the x. Basically, the number in front will affect how high and how low the thing loops, and it will affect if it's, the shape. If it's positive, it's going to open up. If it's negative, it's going to open down. But that -2 has nothing to do with the zeros. It does not affect the zeros at all. So my zeros would be, for the x, would be 0. For x minus 7 would be 7. For x plus 10 would be -10. For x minus 3 would be 3. All right, so let's take a look at number 5. 5 might look scary, but it's not. That k out front, that does not affect the zeros. It's just a constant term, so you can just kind of get rid of it. There's letters, who cares? It's the same thing. If x plus a is a factor, then -a is a 0. If x minus b is a factor, then +b is a 0. If x plus c is a factor, then -c is a 0. And that's it. I'm going to pause this, and why don't you guys take a moment and try number 6, 7, and 8 on your own. All right, let's take a look at 8. It's giving me the factors, so I can write the zeros. If there's a constant in front, it doesn't affect the zeros, so that a means nothing. If there was an x out front, that would mean there's a 0 of 0. But if it's not an x, if it's just a constant term, then it doesn't affect the zeros. -b, -c, +b. All right, now we're going to go in the other direction. I'm going to give you the zeros, and I'm going to ask for the factors. I'm going to ask you to write an equation, because once I have the factors, that's my equation. Remember that factors have x's. So I'm going to start by writing p of x equals, if -4 is a 0, then x plus 4 is a factor. If -2 is a 0, x plus 2 is a factor. If +3 is a 0, then x minus 3 is a factor. And that's your answer. That's going in the other direction. And not only is this an important topic for Algebra 2, this is also a very commonly asked SAT question, this concept. Now, understand that there could be a number in front. There could be a 2 in front. There could be a -5 in front. All I know is that those are the zeros, so I know that those are the factors. But the equation could have something else in front. But I don't know what that is. It doesn't matter what that is right now. I know that the factors have to be those. Let's try number 10. I want my equation, so I do p of x equals, and I need to list the factors. And again, the big connection that you need to make is if I know the zeros, I know the factors, and vice versa. If I know the factors, I know the zeros. So if 6 is a 0, then x minus 6 is a factor. If negative 7 is a 0, then x plus 7 is a factor. If negative 2 is a 0, then x plus 2 is a factor. I want you to try, let's skip to 12. There's a little twist on 12. So it says 0, plus and minus 4, and 7. All that means are the zeros are 0, negative 4, positive 4, and positive 7. That's all that means. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds or so and try this one on your own. Okay, p of x equals, if there's a 0 of 0, that means there's a factor of x. If there's a 0 of negative 4, that means there's a factor of x plus 4. A 0 of 4 gives me a factor of x minus 4. And a 0 of 7 gives me x minus 7. And that's it. Now we're just going to add one little piece, and we're going to add one little concept. And I'm going to give you a graph. So if I give you a graph, well, I can find the zeros. What the zeros are is where the graph hits the x-axis. So my zeros, I'm going to have to pull them off the graph. My zeros are negative 2, 1, and 3. And now that I have my zeros, I can write my equation. So if my zeros are negative 2, 1, and 3, that negative 2 gives me a factor of x plus 2. The positive 1 gives me a factor of x minus 1. And my positive 3 gives me a factor of x minus 3. Now again, there may be something in front. I'm not really worried about that now. What we can be careful of, though, because this thing opens up, it should be positive. If it opened down, then I would know there would have to be a negative in front, and that's what we talked about last time. So we'll talk about the positive, negative, but other than that, we're not going to worry about the value that's in front. It's not really necessary for our purposes right now. This would be my answer. So again, I'm grabbing the zeros where the graph hits the x-axis. And then once I have the zeros, I'm doing the same thing that I did in the last section. Why don't you try number 18 on your own right now? I'm just going to pause to give you a moment to do that. Okay, let's go over it. To write the factors or a polynomial equation, I need the zeros. The zeros is where it crosses the x-axis. So my zeros are negative 2, positive 2, and 3, 4, 5, 6. Now that I have my zeros, I have my factors. If negative 2 is a 0, then x plus 2 is a factor. If positive 2, then x minus 2. And if positive 6, then x minus 6. It's opening up, so it's positive. We're good. One little twist I want to talk about. I want to take a look at number 20. Again, I'm going to start the same way. Find your zeros. So my zeros are negative 2, 1, and 4. But there's something special about one of those zeros. This one bounces off. So we talked about when a zero bounces off, that it's a double root. So here's what that means. When I list my factors, -2 becomes x plus 2. +1 becomes x minus 1. +4 becomes x minus 4. Since there's a double root at -2, this factor, x plus 2, gets a squared because there's two of them. If there's a double root, if it bounces off, that means there's two of them. So for that double root of -2, that corresponding factor, x plus 2, gets a squared. One more thing I want you to add in. Since this thing is opening down, we know it needs to be negative, so you're just going to throw a negative in front. And that would be it. So you need to link in your head factors and zeros. If you know the zeros, you know the factors. If you know the factors, you know the zeros. To go back and forth between them, you're just changing the sign. If you know that the 0 is 2, then you change the sign and put an x in front of it for the factor. If you know the factor, you're changing the sign for the 0. If the 0 is 0, then the corresponding factor is x. And again, that goes backwards as well. And that's it. Your classwork/homework is going to be to finish this worksheet. And again, I can identify factors of a polynomial given the zeros and vice versa by switching the sign. So let me get out of this, and you have this video to look back at whenever you'd like.